All right, welcome to the Cardinal Rule. I am delighted to be joined by Eric Eager, one of my favorite thinkers in all football. Now, folks who watch my channel might know your work, Eric, from when you were with PFF, but they might not be familiar with your more recent endeavor with SumerSports. So for my audience, you might not know you at all or might not yet be familiar with SumerSports. Could you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into doing what you do, and tell us what SumerSports is all about?
Yeah, Joe, thanks for having me on. This is a lot of fun. You and I were talking off air. Like I was a college math professor for 6 years, right out of grad school. I started doing football analytics mostly because I felt like, companies like PFF and Football Outsiders were kind of scraping the surface on what they could do. But I found that like a lot of, I'm a huge football junkie as you are. Watch games and John Madden will say something and I'm like, is that true? And then like now, of course, we're armed with the data to sort of answer those things. And so, I started trying to answer more and more of those questions. Eventually, Chris Collinsworth, who was my boss for at PFF for 7 years or so, took notice, and eventually I became full time there. I started as a senior data scientist, and then eventually I ran the R&D group there for a few years, and then. A couple of years ago, when my new boss, Thomas Dimitroff, was fired by the Falcons, I reached out to him because I had done a bunch of work for him when I was at PFF. And I reached out to him through his analytics guy that I had done a bunch of work for and said, hey, I'd love to like just meet with you and talk with you about what creating a world-class product would look like for a general manager. And he and I became really close. And eventually when Paul Tudor Jones started SumerSports with his son, Jack, they hired Thomas to be the CEO, and then it was just kind of just a matter of time before I joined. And so then I joined in September. We're building, state-of-the-art roster building tools, some content now as everybody can see on SumerSports.com. We have a podcast called the SumerSports Show. So we're trying to kind of, I loved my time at PFF, but as you can imagine, there were obviously, there's a lot of inertia there, and we're sort of building, in my opinion, the football analytics company I would have built had I been able to start the whole thing from scratch.
Nice. And, when I came across SumerSports, I was immediately hooked and excited because I love roster building stuff. I've been a big fan of what PFF does, and I use their data and their grades in my content a lot. But the roster building thing is where I totally nerd out. So when I saw, okay, Eric is bringing his approach to looking more at the roster building side, not as much at the player grading side, that was immediately something that was right up my alley. So I was really excited to, reach out to you and get you on here to talk about some things related to that. And I want to start by talking about something that you published on SumerSports recently. You published an article titled "The Weak Link Nature of Football." Can you talk a little bit about what the concept of weak links means in football, in particular, how it relates to roster building strategies?
Yeah, it's crazy because like the first time I really thought of this actually was in March of 2020, if you can imagine. Like I was at the NFL Scouting Combine and I was talking to an NFL team about their secondary, and we were talking about, okay, should you draft a corner? That was the draft where Jeffrey Okudah went third. And everybody's like, should we draft a corner high, or should we wait a little bit? Like, does it matter, to have a good system? And I, when I was at PFF, I published the whole coverage is more important than pass rush. And, I think a lot of people took that and implied that you should take corners before defensive ends or outside linebacker rusher guys. And it's like, I was sitting there and we were, right before the global pandemic, and we were thinking about, my background's in epidemiology, population dynamics, mathematical ecology, things like that. And I was like, well, honestly, nothing really matters in disease control if a certain threshold of people don't adhere to some of the guidelines. And, it kind of looked, I was like, okay, well, let's actually apply this notion to the secondary. So I went and looked, and I found that if you looked at how a defense did in a given week, it was more strongly correlated with the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth best coverage players on your team than the first or second. And so that was kind of the first weak link research. Similar things applied to offensive line play. Wide receiver play is actually like a low-key weak link system, and I think Cardinals fans probably can appreciate that, having a superstar, true alpha at wide receiver the last few years, but still not necessarily having the passing games that are commensurate with having a receiver as good as he is. And over time, I've kind of tried to think, okay, what's a really good formulation for this? And it came about by reading about basketball. It's like, a current basketball roster, you guys know in Phoenix, you're trying to win a championship now, but you're like, it used to be that the point guard handled the ball and the center was the rim protector and the post-up guy. And now it's like, well, you have the 5 guys, but you really kind of optimize roles. And I think about secondary, like if you think about a secondary as a system where you're looking at the likelihood that no one messes up, that's maximized when the likelihood that each individual player doesn't mess up is equal for each player. And so, if you have Budda Baker and then you have, and Byron Murphy left, but you have, your 2 best guys, they're going to have the same probability of not messing up as your weaker guys when they have harder roles. And so essentially the idea is like, you can't really do much once you're in a season or, in an off season. You can't really overhaul your secondary that much, but you can overhaul the roles. And the idea is to maximize the roles that players have in such a way so that each player has an equal opportunity of not messing up, because that will ultimately maximize the likelihood that the entire group doesn't mess up as a whole.
Interesting. So, seems like there's a couple layers to this. There's one, having that approach, you look for sort of, more breadth, I guess, rather in terms of how you fill those positions. You don't want a weak link. You don't want a substandard cornerback, and you're better off having decent or good across the board rather than 1 star. But there's the other layer, which is the roles, right? And in your article, I think you talk about this a little bit, like, if you have a cornerback who can be elite at one position and another, whether maybe it's slot and on the outside, but one of those, they have someone else who can be serviceable, you put the guy in the role where he's covering for that weakness, if that makes sense. And that's a really interesting.
And that's where the value is. And I think people look at a guy like Budda Baker and like, this is, not to ding my former employer, but they look at a guy like Budda Baker, and this happens a lot of times at linebacker too, where you trust a guy to play a really hard position and he's going to have a weaker grade because you're going to lose more than, like, let's say, I know this, he's played for the Cardinals before, like Trey Boston plays that deep safety role, never makes mistakes, but he also never, like, he's not putting conflict a ton, right? Where you might put your best player in conflict a bunch and he's going to win loss. And in like a grading system like PFF, he might end up having actually a lower grade, even though he's a more valuable player. And, I think about like Devin White in Tampa Bay as a similar guy where he's never graded well via PFF. Roquan Smith is the same way. And it's like, well, maybe they're the fall guy for the defense. Maybe they're there to maybe their losses are minimizing the loss of the defense entirely. Whereas you don't want your, let's say, if you're on the Cardinals, you don't want your outside corners to be put in conflict a ton because their losses are actually much more detrimental to the defense. So you'll throw losses at Budda Baker's way, and so his bad PFF grade might look bad, but it's to the benefit of the team for him to take the shots and not the outside guys.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I know a lot of my audience is sometimes critical of PFFs, and I'm much more sympathetic toward, and I didn't mention this off the air, I did 1 season in the advanced player participation kind of process, and so I have a little bit of insight of how things work, and I think that's a great context you're sharing there in terms of, listen, if you look at grades, sometimes a player has a lower grade because they've drawn the more difficult matchup consistently. And, you just this is part of how you take data within context and understand it a little more loosely, if that makes sense. So that's really great insights on that.
Yeah, and I think that's the hard part about data, right? You'd like to be able to have, and I created PFF WAR, and like I certainly stand by that number, but I also know that there are always going to be holes. Like take a Lamar Jackson. Like Lamar Jackson's the first quarterback in NFL history to rush for 1,000 yards with more than 50% of his rush attempts being designed runs, right? Designed runs are usually most of the value is generated by the offensive line. But when it's a quarterback, it's a little bit different, right? So Lamar Jackson's always going to have lower WAR than a quarterback of similar stature who's a drop back passer. And you just have to take the good with the bad there. You just know that your model is going to underestimate that. The same way that, when Shoni Atani for the I almost said California Angels, the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim.
Mhm.
These models aren't meant to model a guy who pitches and hits at the rates that he does. And so you just have to know that estimate is going to be off in those very boundary cases. And a place like PFF, the systems become commoditized enough where maybe they're not evolving necessarily to capture all of the little nooks and crannies of what the league entails.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So, in terms of the weak link sort of thing, from a roster building perspective, you've talked about coverage as more of a weak link approach. Uh, I know you've talked about in the past, and we reference offensive line as a weak link typically approach you want. You rather have 5 solid guys than one stud and a bunch of, not so great guys. Can you quickly talk about other positions groups and whether they're more towards the weak link or strong link? Because obviously that informs how you approach the draft and free agency with those positions.
Yeah, quarterback being the strongest link, system.
Mhm.
If you get a quarterback, it sort of overcomes a lot. If the quarterback gets hurt, as Cardinals fans know, there's not a whole lot you can do. Although in 2021 they did fine, without Murray for a while. But it's sort of when Murray was injured, this team has really struggled when he plays injured.
Mhm.
Um, so that's a strong link system. It's sort of on a continuum. Like wide receiver is a weak link system, but having a great number one guy is more helpful than having a great number one corner, for
Mm.
example, just because as an offense, you dictate more than a defense does. You can't go to the opposing offense and say, don't throw at my number two corner because he stinks.
Right.
Whereas you can design an offense in a
Mm.
lot of cases that will just throw to your number one. Now that breaks down in the playoffs and stuff like that, as Packers fans know, and as Cardinals fans know, and even the Chiefs, the one year they lost the Super Bowl was because they didn't get the same production out of guys like Sammy Watkins that they got in the year they won the Super Bowl in 19. So it's on a continuum. Defensive line's a weak link system, but it's more strong link than the secondary, right? If you have a
Mm.
one pass rusher who can really create havoc, he's going to be valuable, even relative to a number one corner. So it's all on a continuum. I'd say secondary, offensive line, they're the weakest link systems. Then you're looking at wide receiver, defensive line. Then you're looking at quarterback. And quarterback is, obviously the strong link. Quarterbacks can overcome a ton, especially when they're that truly elite tier. They're really the only thing that matters in some cases.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So talking about the Cardinals a little bit more, many Cardinals fans have been kind of frustrated by the lack of big moves, splash moves early in free agency. Can you talk a little bit about some of the different waves or periods of free agency and where the value lies therein? And should Cardinals fans be frustrated about not signing players early, or should we be glad that Monty Ossenfort is waiting a little bit later into free agency to make most of his moves?
Yeah, you always have these like seminal moments in your understanding of the game, right? I remember back in 14 when, you look at Tampa Bay and they had Clinton McDonald and Alteron Werner and Michael Johnson and I want to say Brandon Myers all holding up those jerseys on the first day of free agency. And it's like, and then Michael Johnson was literally cut the following year, and the Bengals got him back and a comp pick for him because he went to Tampa Bay for a year. you know, it's fun, and I hate to bite the hand that feeds me, but there's the fun of free agency. It's a great week on the football calendar. But most of the signings that have happened over the last 2 or 3 days, reportedly, they're not going to influence the league much, right? There's a couple here and there, but because a lot of times, and Jason Fitzgerald, one of my good friends, writes for Over the Cap, wrote about this a couple years ago. It's because they happen in non-premium positions. Like all of the marquee signings the last few days have been at defensive tackle, which is defensive tackles on the boundary of being a premium position, as is corner. But like most of the signings have been for big dollar guys, have been guards, centers, linebackers, safeties, running backs will come. I think a little bit. We got Montgomery to Detroit yesterday. And those positions, like for better, like those positions, the only thing you're buying is a higher floor. And I think a lot of people don't really see that. When they see these signings, they're looking at, oh, we're raising the team's ceiling, which is really not actually what's happening. For the Cardinals, like you're not really in a position right now where raising your floor matters all that much because you're the quarterback's injured. We don't know when he'll be back, but the roster in and of itself needs a little bit of a remake. And you don't, I think that when you remake a roster, what you really need to do is, acquire great players at premium positions and then use free agency to fill in the gaps at non-premium positions. So to start that process backwards, and the Bears are kind of doing that. They did get a premium position player in the trade with DJ Moore, but to go backwards is going to leave people, I think, disappointed because, for a guard to really have the impact that you want him to in free agency, you need a left tackle that's a plus player. For a safety, so you look at Atlanta, Jesse Bates. For Jesse Bates to have the real influence that you need the corners on the team to be quite good. And so I think when you look at Arizona, you're looking at, okay, where are they strong at wide receiver? Kind of, but with Hopkins eventually being traded, it's really Hollywood Brown and Greg Dortch, I think is okay. And so no, the answer is no, right? Are you really strong at corner? Not really, not really at all, frankly. So if you acquire a safety in free agency, how much is that going to benefit you? Are you really good at edge? No. So if you acquire a defensive tackle, is that really going to help you all that much? Probably not. So I think, Monty Ossenforth, coming from the Patriot way, I think understands this about as well as anybody. So I think that, laying off in free agency feels to me a smart move for them, at least initially.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's kind of my read as well. Wait for those value players to maybe plug a few holes, but really lean in the draft. And you talked about the weird kind of roster composition. And, and I know we were talking about this a little bit before we went live in terms of, how do Cardinals fans feel about what Steve Keim did? Our roster got kimed, as I like to say. And, it's weird. Like Buda Baker is beloved, right? So you cannot speak ill of Buda Baker, but I also understand building at safety versus corners kind of backwards, right? And building inside linebackers. And, I think Cardinals fans really like Zaven Collins from what we saw last year. And we think Isaiah Simmons has potential, but I also think most Cardinals fans in this regard are clear-eyed that we realize that going inside linebacker back-to-back first rounds was not sound. And, kind of ignoring edge and cornerback, neglecting those positions, neglecting offensive line. The feedback I get from Cardinals fans is that they really understand that. And they, as much as they might like some of those players, they're also frustrated by what Steve Keim is, he who shall not be named for some fans. So I think, that's something that a lot of Cardinals fans see and recognize. And, but a lot of them are also impatient. So they want those big splash moves. So yeah, another thing that I think Cardinals fans are really, thinking about and pondering and debating is what to do with the third overall pick. Right. And this is the big question. Do you sit there at 3 and, there's good chance Will Anderson's going to be available based on how things have lined up. It's not a certainty, but likely he will be there. So do you take the quote unquote generational talent, right, at edge rusher, or do you trade back and get a haul, from a team that is looking to move up and get that third quarterback if that materializes as an opportunity? What are your thoughts based on what the data tell us and the best practices of roster building? What would be your take on the most prudent way to approach that third overall pick?
Yeah, and having the 34th pick and also 2 picks in the third round, on one end, I just talked about premium positions, right? And it doesn't get more premium other than quarterback than to go with Will Anderson at 3 as an edge player. But the fact is that third pick is going to have less utility to the Cardinals than it is going to have to a team like Detroit or Las Vegas, or a team that's going to try to move up and get a quarterback and get that third guy. And so it's almost always, I'm actually finishing a book right now where I talked about the Jets trading up to 3 for Sam Darnold and giving, I think it was 37, 49 and a future 2 as well as 6 to the Colts. And like that pick, that trade was an ultimate winner, even though Darnold kind of like actually lived up. He didn't live up to the pick, but Darnold wasn't as big of a disaster statistically as maybe it looked. And yet the Colts just ripped their eyes out because it's just there's so much value inherent in getting those extra picks and getting extra bites at the apple that, as long as you're not kind of doing what the Vikings did last year, which is moving back from 12 to 32, right? That takes you kind of out of that premium position place and puts you into the drafting safeties place that they ended up with Lewis Cine. Like, I think you're fine, right? So if you can move, Detroit has 6, you move back to 6, you're probably still going to get a Jalen Carter, or you might even get Will Anderson, frankly, the way things work out. You're going to get, or Tyree Wilson, the edge player from Texas Tech, who a lot of people like. Like, there's options there, and the data is unequivocal. Like, if you don't need a quarterback, you should be trying to trade out of that pick. And for example, like we estimated at Sumer that the Bears got 142 million of value when they traded back from 1 to 9. It's just overwhelming. And if they deemed that they didn't need a quarterback, so it ended up working out. And you almost can't blame the Panthers for doing it either, because they need a quarterback. The Cardinals here, have already bought into Murray. It's unfortunate he got injured, especially this year where he's cheap, but use that advantage and get more players.
I'm of the same mind, but a lot of fans are going to hear that and still not care. And fans going to fan, as I like to say, but there's some good edge rushers. I love BJ Ojulari as maybe someone you get in the second round, right? And then if you trade back and maybe you get Van Ness or someone like that, if you can get 3 or 4 starters out of that pick, they might not be Will Anderson, but you can still get more value, as you've talked about. So we could talk about this all day, but I know you have a lot to do today and you will be talking about this all day. So I want to give you a chance just to let my audience know more about what kind of content they can expect from SumerSports, anything you have coming up in the pipeline on the YouTube channel or on the site, and anything else you want to share before we get out of here.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate that. And it's been a lot of fun talking. At SumerSports.com, we have, articles. We're basically pumping them out about once a week, as far as, 2 or 3, looking at big name ideas. So I know, like I said, you guys are going for a championship in basketball. So we had, what's the analogous mid-range jump shot in the NFL, relative to basketball. We're looking at, weak link systems. We're looking at contract restructures. So if anybody is sort of wondering what happens when a contract is restructured, that's on the website. As of yesterday, Tuesday, the 14th. We have a Sumer Sports Show, which you can find on any of your podcast platforms, as well as YouTube. We have a YouTube channel where we splice up some of those videos and have some educational content as well with myself and Thomas. And we have free agency shows Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So this week we have one more on Wednesday. We're going to do live from our office in Atlanta. So a ton of stuff that we're really excited for. A lot of stuff on the behind the scenes on the B2B side as well, that makes me really excited to work in this really kind of vibrant field of football analytics right now.
Awesome. Well, all the links are going to be in the description of the video. So folks who are watching, make sure you subscribe to SumerSports on YouTube, follow them on Twitter, follow Eric on Twitter, check out the website, bookmark it. I can't say enough good things about the content that's already coming out from SumerSports, and I'm excited to see what's on the horizon. Eric, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I'd love to talk to you again sometime in the future, down the road. We'll touch base. But you've got a big day ahead of you. I look forward to seeing what you have to share about free agency and then the draft coming up. Have a great day, and I thank you for your time.
Joe, this has been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.